mythicists who insist that Josephus didn't mention Jesus argue that Origen of Alexandria, who mentioned is the first, is the earliest church father that we know of that mentioned Josephus mentioning Jesus. And what they'll say is that he confused Jesus, son of N.E.W.S, who appears at the end of the James story and is appointed high priest in the place of N.E.W.S ben N.E.W.S, because N.E.W.S killed James, and he was removed from power for having done that, and Jesus, son of Daniel, was put in power. So they claim that Jesus, son of Danius, was the brother of that James, and he was put in power as recompense for what happened to James.
Right. So that particular theory, there's I think there's only been one peer-reviewed article on that theory that came out in the Journal of Early Christian Studies in 2012, I think, by Richard Carrier. And I don't think that it has convinced any scholar that I know of. And the reason why it's not convincing is because, well, is because the Jesus, son of Damnius, mentioned at the very end of the passage, is introduced as a new character. And the Jesus who is called Christ, who is mentioned before the son of Damnius, is clearly a different character in the story. And there's nothing wrong with the manuscript tradition, okay, for Jesus who is called Christ. It's in the manuscripts. There's no problem with the manuscripts. It's perfectly plausible that Josephus was aware of Christ. Any Roman in the year 93 on the streets of Rome would have been familiar with Christ, that there was this weird cult of people who worship this guy called Christ. That's not news anymore in the year 93, okay? So absolutely no problem with the textual tradition. And the connection of James and Jesus who is called Christ is so firm in the Christian tradition and confirms everything that Josephus says, that there's really no reason to doubt that there is a problem in the manuscripts. Now, Origen, interestingly, when he gets to this passage, and Eusebius, when they read Josephus, they're reading it with these Christian goggles on, and they're mining Josephus in order to prove their Christian doctrines. Okay, so Josephus tells you a bunch of things that led to the outbreak of the war, and this is one of them. And then what Origen and Eusebius do is they make this relationship sort of more causal, and they want to say, well, the death of James actually caused the outbreak of the Jewish war because it's God's wrath, and so on and so forth. And you could see, it's not a complete distortion. You could see with Christian goggles on how they could derive that from Josephus or make it seem like Josephus actually said that directly. But no, that's not the case. So obviously Christian readings of this passage, you have to take that with a grain of salt. But in terms of the passage itself, there's nothing seriously wrong here. And the tradition of James's martyrdom, okay, it does get mythicized. Absolutely, it gets mythicized, okay? So absolutely, I would take Josephus over Hegesippus, 100, or 75 years later, okay? And there's stuff in the Nag Hammadi library about how James dies, and that's how myths that's how something historical gets mythicized. The martyrdom becomes more and more glorious and grand. But the James isn't stoned. He falls from the top of the temple and he's beaten with a fuller's club. And they really kind of soup it up, okay, by the 2nd century. But that's not an indication that Josephus isn't telling the truth or that there's any kind of problem in this story. And James, I think it's safe to say that in the year 62, which recall, is only 2 years before 64. And by 64, we know that Romans could definitely identify Christians and distinguish them from Jews. And I think in Jerusalem, where Josephus was in 62, he could definitely tell who the sect of Christians were, the followers of Jesus. And we definitely know from Paul that James was one of the pillars. And so, and James also, according to tradition, is the brother of Christ. Okay, and that's very, very early in the tradition. So there's nothing wrong with Josephus' story, and Jesus, the son of Damnius, is introduced at the end of the story as a new character, and then simply dropped as ultimately not really entirely important for the narrative as a whole. So I think it takes more mental gymnastics to try to, first of all, get rid of the reference to Jesus, the so-called Christ, okay? Nope, you don't need to get rid of that. And then to say that the Jesus, son of Damnius, at the end of the passage, flip him up and identify him with the Jesus who is the brother of James. I think that just takes a lot of mental gymnastics. And for any of those who want to read that peer-reviewed article by Carrier, you should. It's a lengthy article, and you see he has to bend over backwards and do all sorts of gymnastics with the text in order to make that even remotely convincing. But in the end, simplest is best. There's nothing wrong with the manuscripts. And Jesus, the so-called Christ, is most certainly a different character than Jesus, son of Damnius.